the exact time, but it was when they were reopened for the first time in a long time. And people began pushing out these images of these women that seemed to be wearing liturgical clothes and doing things like performing Eucharist, like standing in positions of prayer and even preaching, and all of these images. And it was like, what is this? I've never seen these before. And then what I found is that there is has been a long history studied with these types of catacombs, that we see women's early leadership in the church. And we're talking about really the third and the fourth centuries, although some of these catacombs most of them date from like the mid third century to like the fifth century is what we see. So it's in that like a century after the end, if you think about the Bible concluding around the beginning of the second century. So we're thinking about, 100, 150 years after that. So relatively close, historically speaking. And what we see is women depicted in the same type of leadership roles as men. And actually, there in some places there are more women depicted in these types of leadership roles than men. I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating when we
Mm.
look at this history. And so I wanted to go see one of these women, and so that's what we went in the Priscilla catacombs. Saw a woman who is, probably she's in the cubicle of the veiled woman, is what the room is called, the room of the veiled woman,
Huh.
and she's literally standing there in what we call the position, the Orans position, which is with your arms raised up. And this is a very particular stylized position that represents authority, that was used frequently, not just in Christian history, but also for other religious figures. This is an authoritative position that we see. And we see women being depicted in these Christian spaces in
Mhm.
these authoritative
Mhm.
positions. And
Mhm.
like one of the women, in there's another catacomb in Naples where we actually see two women that are depicted with also the gospels around them, and
Mm.
with tongues of fire coming out of those gospels, and with their mouth, it's clearly, the art history suggests that these women are not just leaders, but they actually are probably serving in the role of bishop.
Wow.
And so it's literally written
Mhm.
on the walls that
Right.
women were serving in these leadership roles in the early Christian world. Mhm.
So this brings me to something that I
Yeah.
that I talk about in my own book, but I noticed, and this is kind of redoubling of devotion during the
Yeah.
time of this empire takeover of Christianity, right? So would you tie those two things together at all? The takeover, essentially, of the empire into Christianity and to the institutional church specifically, and this leads to a few different things. It was
Mhm.
kind of like make Rome great again, or Constantinople great again, and
Yes, indeed.
also it seems like there are then people who go out into devotion into the desert. And at this time, do you also see a rejection of women in institutional roles in the church at the same time from a historical standpoint?
Yes. So I do think, this is one of the things that we know in when we think about women's history, at moments where the church starts becoming more institutionalized, we often see women having a harder time being recognized in leadership positions. So it's often in those moments when the church is like still in formation, when it isn't as widely accepted, in which really, people are doing what is needed to be done to push the gospel forward in whatever way. And it's a very practical sort of like, yeah, God calls you to, you can think about Paul. It's like my coworkers in Christ. I have these women here, I have these men here. We're all
Mhm,
doing this work of God and we're all working together. And this is what we kind of see. But when
mhm,
we see the church getting closer with political rulers, what we often see is the rules being changed
mhm,
and being redefined in a ways. And those redefinitions are often not good news for women. So yes, we see this happening in the early church, where, there's still rooms for women. There's still room for women. They're
Mhm,
so close to
mhm,
the disciples of Jesus, some of which were women. They're so
mhm,
close to these stories and this female leadership that I think it's harder for them to write women out completely.
mhm,
But we do have this growing fear of female sexuality, that women are dangerous to
mhm,
especially male clergy. And
mm,
so this causes separation between women and men, and
okay.
also contributes to women um, often having less opportunity to be in these leadership roles.
Mm,
Um, Although they still manage it. They still do. Many of these desert mothers that you talk about
mhm,
are still becoming these significant leaders
mhm,
in the early church. And we see this actually continue all the way throughout what we would call the late antique period, up
mhm,
through the 5th century and into the early medieval world, which lasts roughly to the year 1000, where we have significant models of women serving in leadership positions that are parallel to men.